boats and daisy chains. Can't seem to recall my true giving.
Welcome to the social-engineer.org podcast number 55.
55.
It's not like Dave.
I miss Dave, yeah.
It's not that deep, booming voice. You can't really pull off deep and booming.
It was an ode to Dave.
How are you today, Michelle?
I am still recovering from RSA. My feet will never be the same.
They are now swollen in size 14.
Really attractive.
Weird looking on a Japanese person. Size 14 foot. How about you, Jordan?
I did not go to RSA, even though it's about a block away from my place here in San Francisco. I've heard mixed reviews, so, I'll leave it at that. So I'm just like, all right, maybe I'll go if it's free, but if it's not free...
Oh, it's not free.
Right, exactly.
It's a vendor-centric conference, so it's all about the vendors. We made some excellent contacts there and had some great conversations with some really intelligent people. So for us, RSA was quite successful and a very good conference for us to go to. We launched a few things there, so it was kind of good. It is about 4 billion miles of walking, and Michelle had the wrong shoes, and it was pouring rain.
Oh, yeah.
So, things were bad in foot world.
They got better.
They got better. After it dried up, the rain stopped. It was really torrential for one day, and then we had one umbrella for 3 of us.
No one sells umbrellas in San Francisco, so you couldn't have fixed that problem, no matter what.
Nobody. There's no umbrellas. I'll tell you what doesn't happen when it rains. We could not get a taxi for the life of us. It took us forever to get a taxi.
Lyft or Uber or any of those things?
Oh, right. So I went to Uber. We went to order a taxi, and it started off, 6 minutes. And then a minute later, 10 minutes. Oh, I'm sorry. Taxis are being overburdened.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah.
And then it was like 20 minutes. And then it was like, you'd just be waiting for the rest of the day for a taxi. There's one taxi driver in San Francisco.
Yeah, it reached a point where they weren't even picking up the ladies. It was very sad.
Yeah, let's talk about exciting, not sad things, like our training coming up. We have a bunch of stuff happening. May, we're going to Dublin, so definitely excited about that. And then Black Hat, we are getting people signing up for that class, so that's great to see. And then November, we're finishing out the year in beautiful Baltimore, right on the harbor. You got 3 chances left in 2014 for our public classes for the 5-day training, Advanced Practical Social Engineering. So if you are interested in that, check out the site, social-engineer.com. Make sure you email us any questions, and we can definitely help you out with that. We just talked about RSA. We got the new book, got launched just a couple weeks ago. I've been excited about it because Amazon sold out twice already from the book, so that's kind of cool. Unmasking the Social Engineer, the Human Side of Security. Dun, dun, dun. That's the way you have to say it whenever you say the book title.
It is. It's much more dramatic that
way. It is. Drama will help sell the book, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you buy this, you will learn the deep, dark secrets of malicious social engineers. I think we can successfully announce that we have something really big happening. We redid the .org website. It is being launched April 1st. It is beautiful. Would you say beautiful, Michelle?
It is very, very beautiful and much more easier to navigate.
It's easier to navigate and beautiful. I love it. So it's been 6 years or so that we've had the .org the way it's looked, with little upgrades here or there, and now we are finally taking it to the next level, making research easier. The whole site will be considered a research tool, so things will be searchable based on tags. We're organizing information much better. So although when we launch, not everything will be rewritten, but we are in the process of rewriting the framework.
And those of you waiting, expect that we will be opening registration for DEF CON Social Engineering CTF along with that launch as well.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yes, thank you.
That needed a dun, 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 because I'm going to actually spill a little bit of the beans, okay, Michelle?
Sure.
I'm spilling it just for you wonderful listeners. We are changing up the CTF this year. So first, big thing, when you register, and we know many of you are waiting to do so, you will need to submit a video telling us why you should be part of the competition. You're going to really have to sell us on the reasons why. We want to see you telling us exactly why you need to be part of the CTF. And then, once we choose you, you're going to be in a tag team competition. So we're expanding the time frame. You're going to get 30 minutes instead of 20. But you're going to have to tap out and tag your partner, which, by the way, you do not get to choose your partner. We choose them for you. And you will then have to tag out a certain amount of times during the competition, during phone calls. It's just going to be crazy and fun. And we're going to hopefully still continue with our here's what we can learn from the CTF this year. So That will be launched April 1st, the registration, along with our brand new website. So some really cool things to look forward to. Shortly after we launch the site, we will be launching our CTF for Kids, so our SE CTF for Kids at DEF CON. And this year the theme is Who's Done It, where the kids will be solving a international cyber crime. And that's all I'm going to tell you on that, because we are trying to make this way harder than we have in the previous years, because these stinking little kids continually solve all these clues like way too fast. We're hoping to have them suffer a little bit this year.
Yeah, we want to see real tears this year.
Real tears, not fake tears. Yeah, we want the little boys crying, not just the little girls. We want we want sweat and blood and tears. So that's our goal. So we have been working hard on these things over the last couple months, and we'll continue to do so. If you're interested in sponsoring either of those events, reach out to us now. We're actually kind of organizing ourselves after 5-6 years of doing this, so things are going to be done in a more structured pattern. We're going to be closing the sponsor doors earlier this year. We already have 2 companies that will be sponsoring so far. We'll close the doors after a couple more, so we have some people who are interested. So get back to us as soon as you can. Let me see. One other thing. I know Dave's not here, but like to just mention DerbyCon in September. You could check out the website at derbycon.com. We love that conference. It's one of our favorites. If you haven't been there or you're thinking about going, check out the dates. We'll be doing a training as well as some speeches, so you get to see our team. Michelle and I will be out there, maybe some others. I'm not sure how many of the team's coming, but I know Michelle and I will be there. So we're excited about that too. Okay, so our guest this month is, we should have a drum roll for this. Man, that was a terrible drum roll. Paul Kelly. If you're saying, hey, I know that name, but where do I know it from? You know it because he's the technical editor for my book. A little background on Paul. When I started writing the second book, Unmasking the Social Engineer, we partnered with Dr. Ekman on making sure everything we said was scientifically accurate, at least with the most current research that we could possibly use and find. He recommended one of his lead trainers to be an editor for the book, so that way he had more time to kind of devote to reading all the chapters and making sure that we made sense when it came to the nonverbal side and things that we were saying, plus his experience. The guy was a Secret Service agent. He taught in the National Security Organization, worked with all sorts of U.S. intelligence agencies. He studied PSYOPs. The list goes on and on and on of what this guy's accomplished. So his experience was invaluable to the book. And he's also one of the 5% that were identified back in the late 70s by Dr. Sullivan and Dr. Ekman as one of what they called the truth wizards, the people who had that natural ability to read facial expressions without training. So he was very valuable in our help with the book. So we decided to have him on the podcast this month, talk about his life experiences and what else we can learn from him. So let's get him on the show now. Paul Kelly. Paul, it's nice to have you with us today.
Hi, good afternoon, or at least good afternoon here on the East Coast.
Good afternoon for some of us.
For some of us, I guess, and I could say good morning to our West Coast participants.
Paul, maybe you could just give us a little background on you, some of your experiences, the things that you did to help our listeners understand of why we would have you on the show.
Well, I think coming out of college, I was a political science major with emphasis in international relations and specifically in Asia. I had started studying Chinese language in my sophomore year. I graduated, was commissioned into the United States Marine Corps as a second lieutenant, but it was a coincidence or not, given my interest in Asian studies, I was given the opportunity for some direct participation by going to Vietnam, where I served for, a little over a first tour. My second tour was cut short after I was wounded for the second time. I came back, and I had orders to language school with the Defense Language Institute, where I studied more Chinese. Then, when I got out of the Marine Corps, I was actually assigned to the 1st Brigade, which is in Hawaii, and I had started going part-time to grad school, so I got out and started going full-time to grad school, getting a master's degree in Chinese studies. Emphasis more on political science, though, than the language, although I continued to have it. It was then, in 1971, that Henry Kissinger made what we call the secret trip to China and announced the upcoming trip by President Nixon to China in 1972. And that was the impetus for me to apply and join the United States Secret Service. And I served with them from 1972 until 1996. I had a bunch of different things there. I was an instructor at their training academy. I taught, amongst other things, interviewing techniques. And then after I retired from the Secret Service, I was doing a lot of government contract work. The one program in particular, or two, one was the International Law Enforcement Academy, which was being run out of Budapest, Hungary at the time. I got to meet a lot of folks from all over Europe and Eastern Europe. And then the other one was a group called ATAP, the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program. And that got me into places, especially in post 9/11, very much in the Muslim world, specifically the Arab world, in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, but also into Southern Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. I've just had a lot of traveling. I used my experience with Secret Service background to participate in security support for several Olympic Games, going all the way back to Lake Placid and most recently the Chinese Olympics in Beijing, and things like the World Cup of Soccer and the Mediterranean Games, the World University Games. So I've had the opportunity to travel and meet all kinds of folks.
Were there major differences in your techniques you used when interviewing people from, let's say, America versus Middle Eastern countries versus Asian countries?
Before Ekman, my training had really come from the military and also as a federal agent. I think my interviewing technique changed almost fundamentally after meeting Paul Ekman and working with him, and that is my awareness really increased. One of the things Ekman really focuses on is teaching you to be an active listener and an active observer, and I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to those two concepts.
And that applies regardless of the culture that you're interviewing in.
I think generally it applies regardless. I think that one of the things that we had talked about before, so a little unique perhaps to different cultures, it'd be some nonverbal examples, and one of them would be what you and I call emblems, and they are culturally specific gestures made by people that actually can take the place of words or be used in conjunction with them. And you have to make sure you know the culture of your audience, the subject, because what you think a symbol might mean in our culture could mean something entirely different in another culture, and it can be very counterproductive at times, not to mention embarrassing. I think you mentioned that in your book.
I did, thanks to your help with understanding all of that.
Now, an example of that, is that like when you make the AOK symbol with your fingers on your hand, but in Brazil it means like b-hole?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. It depends on the audience. Even the thumbs up is another one, depending on what we think that means and what some other cultures think that means. I mean, the thumb could be going in the AOK circle, if you know what I mean.
Right.
The best example that I used was the V for victory, in which if you make that, just call it the peace sign or whatever, when you make that, your palm is facing the subject. You're looking at your fingernails when you make that V. If you turn your wrist around so that the palm is facing you and those two fingernails are facing out, in the UK, that's like giving somebody the finger. We had a president of the United States traveling in a Commonwealth country, being welcomed in a motorcade, and everyone waving the flags, and he wanted to give them the V for victory sign, and he turned his wrist around and made the paper that he was flipping off the people of the guest country. I don't think politically what he wanted to do.
Not the greatest achieving moment, because that ended up on the cover of a bunch of newspapers and things like that.
Yeah, you can't just say, Slovenia, Slovakia. You have to be aware of the culture that you're going into. And, one of them was, Lonely Planet. They have a lot of travel books, and in their travel books for whatever country they're talking about, they often have a thing on gestures, culturally specific gestures to that country. It's a great thing because it's emphasizing the nonverbal.
Let me ask you a question about going back, as you made a couple mentions of how things changed. When did you start working with Dr. Ekman?
Off the top of my head, I'd say it was about 2004 or 2005. I was actually attending a conference on domestic terrorism. One of the speakers was a psychologist with the Paul Ekman Group, and that's when I first heard about micros, facial micro expressions. I was actually traveling, and in fact, I was actually going to be going back to Afghanistan in the very near future after that conference. And when he mentioned that a characteristic feature of these micro expressions are that they are cross-cultural, you could say universal, and they are involuntary. And that got me thinking, probably like many people, that this was going to be the Pinocchio's nose that everybody was looking for in terms of investigations and interviewing. Of course, I realized much later that there is no Pinocchio nose, that micros, being cross-cultural and being involuntary, are a tremendous skill set to use in almost any context.
So once you heard that speech and you obviously realized that there was some merit that could help you with your work.
Specifically, I went up and say, listen, I'm going to Afghanistan. Are you telling me if I study this stuff, I can use this over there? And he said, yes, I am. And I said, well, what about I'll be using an interpreter? And he said, well, as long as you trust the interpreter, that's in a way even better because you've asked the question, and while the interpreter is saying it in the native language, that's when you can concentrate on that person's face. It was amazing. In fact, I think I told you one of the ones when I went over and I saw this fantastic micro of disgust as somebody was supposedly speaking in a positive manner about the American presence in Afghanistan. One of the big things that I think, again, Chris's book brings out is that you can learn these micros to recognize them and to identify specifically which emotion you briefly saw as opposed to what might being displayed in the macro sense. But it does not answer the why question as to why did I see a micro of fear when he told me everything is okay. Knowing that, that's a tremendous tool for the interviewer to be able to go, or the therapist to be able to go to at some point and say, well, let's go back and talk a little more about whatever we were talking about.
So when you saw this guy showing disgust, what did you do?
At the time, it was a protocol-type situation in a social sense. The American team was being introduced, and this guy says, we really appreciate the American assistance in Afghanistan. And when he said that, there was this real micro of disgust. You know, I'm not going to call him out at that point in a diplomatic setting, but I'm wondering, well, okay, what is he disgusted at? Is he disgusted at the American presence? Is he disgusted that his country is in such turmoil that he needs external help? Is he disgusted because other people don't agree with him on that? And this is another key tenet of Ekman's training, and that is when you start to develop a theory, always look for another possible explanation. An alternate hypothesis is the psycho jargon of what you just saw. Okay, I'm seeing fear with the suspect that I'm interviewing. Well, I could say he's afraid because he knows I've caught him. That's one possibility. It could also be he's afraid because he didn't do it and he's beginning to believe I think he did do it.
And so really, Paul, what you're talking about is just this idea of confirmation bias. And if we believe something, we're going to start to look for those indicators that prove us to be right.
That's an excellent point, Michelle, and that's exactly the kind of pitfall many, even law enforcement, get into, because you have to try and keep your objectivity. If you don't, you're going to segue out and you're going to be listening for things you want to hear, or see. And that is tragic. Fundamentally, Ekman's training also, even with law enforcement, or let's say military intel types, as much as we're trying to recognize deception, you also want to be trained to recognize the truth. Being able to make a educated assessment on those two will help you narrow down your suspect pool quite a bit.
But it's really got to be quite difficult, right? If you are interviewing someone, because we're all human, we will tend to have theories or feelings about certain things in certain situations. So do you have ways or techniques or methods that you use to try to stay very sort of removed from making that emotional assessment?
As I mentioned earlier, one of mine was I always wanted to see the subject before I began the interview, because you have to remove as much of your bias or your preconception as you can and listen to it and not make a rush to judgment. This is one of the things the people that Ekman and O'Sullivan identified in their studies as the truth wizards. They took all the time that they could before they made the decision so that they could make it on as many different factors that they observed or heard as possible, not just making one. When we're training people, somebody will see something in a case study and go, oh, he's lying. We really want to discourage that, because if you think that, you might say he might be lying. That's okay. But if you say he's lying at that point, you've lost your objectivity. You're going to miss things during the rest of the interview.
Right, absolutely.
Would you say that what's important then is trying to set a baseline right up front so that way you could tell when there's a change in that, or is that even the wrong method to go?
Oh, no, Chris, I think, you've hit a key point in interviewing right there, and that is, first and foremost, you want to establish as best you can in the time available a baseline for the subject, a baseline of the subject's behavior, the mannerisms, their voice, and then we look for what Ekman calls a hotspot. A hotspot is a deviation from baseline. Whether it's any one of those channels, we talk about the different channels of communication. Of course, one of those are micros. So if you see a change in pattern or a change in voice pitch or voice style, and that's a departure from your recognized baseline of the subject, that's worth taking note of and what we're talking about at that time.
So how do you do that if you don't have a sufficient amount of time? Like I'm thinking even your fields or in our field, we're walking up into a building. Within a few seconds, I have to approach a subject. How am I setting a baseline within a matter of seconds and not really having a chance to talk to that person first?
That's the 24-karat gold question that we're trying to come up with. At some point, I'm going to try and buy some time, whether I can try and do rapport building or do what, again, you mentioned in your book, the amygdala hijack, to try and get some sympathy on my side from the other person. We're just going to have to go into the questioning, and the questioning then the baseline is starting at that point.
What do you think has helped you hone your abilities, both observational and interview? What's been like the one thing you think that's helped you the most?
It's a product. I thought it was pretty interesting when Ekman and O'Sullivan did their research on the wizards. There were very few undergraduate wizards, if you might call it that. So I think part of it's life experience. I think without being formally trained in micros, I think a lot of people see something and they don't know or understand what they've seen, but they pick up on it. And so consequently, they'll say, I got a bad feeling about this guy, or my gut tells me this, or, call it intuition. I think they've picked up a lot of that through the process. So, for example, I never knew about micros until I started meeting Ekman. But during my career as a federal agent, I have to think that there would be several times when somebody, by the reaction that I saw, not knowing what it was, it didn't fit. It wasn't right. There are some differences, for example, fundamentally in Secret Service, and I would like to think other law enforcement agencies, we're looking for anomalies. If there's 1,000 people cheering to see their candidate for the president, and there's somebody else in the crowd who's sulking around, that's the one who's going to come to my attention, I hope.
So what percentage now of your analysis of people is second nature, where you say, I have a bad feeling about this guy, and what sort of percentage is you going, all right, micro expression here is this guy is also doing that, it's off from his baseline, that's suspicious. Like what percent of it is gut, and what percent of it is your academic training sort of coming into play?
Today I'd like to think it's all of the above. The biggest thing is, especially in a social context, once you learn to be able to recognize and identify, say, a facial micro expression, then it's not a switch that you can turn on and off kind of thing. You're going to see them probably more than you'd like to see them, especially when we start talking about micros like disgust and contempt. The question is, what do you want to do about it? And what do you need to do about it in a social context? If I see a hot spot where somebody's telling me everything's okay, but the micro that flashed before their response or at the onset of their response was anger, is it necessary to confront that person and say, gee, you told me everything's okay, but what's bothering you? It's like with the wizards, a lot of times people say, do you think I'm lying? And the answer is, who cares? I don't care if you're lying or not, because there's no consequence in this context of whether you're lying to me or not. And there's also no stress or consequence for you being caught in a lie. Those are critical factors. If somebody is consciously lying to an authority figure, then we're hoping, and I would defer to the psychologists out there, that unless somebody's a sociopath, they're going to have some stress or anxiety about knowingly lying to that authority figure. And that causes the leakage of these channels of communication that can create the hotspots that we're looking for.
When you and I talked about that before, Paul, like my son, his baseline is he's got like this jittery leg. His leg's always bouncing. Some people view that as someone who's nervous all the time, and because they're nervous, they must be deceptive, right? right? But that's just his baseline.
Yep.
I know that that's just Colin. But when his leg stops bouncing, now I know something's wrong, right?
Well, it's a change in baseline, isn't it?
Right.
But this is why it's a fallacy to have one signal that you think is the absolute betrayal that somebody is being deceptive. The worst one that I've seen or heard, and it comes from some experienced people, who would say, I knew he was lying because he would not look me in the eye. Where'd you come up with that?
Right.
You know, I mean, in some cultures, looking an authority figure in the eye is seen as a challenge. It can have its consequences. I had one the other day, another nonverbal kind of body language thing. We talk about a single shoulder shrug, where when somebody's talking, one shoulder goes up, but not the other ones. When people shrug, they normally shrug with both shoulders. There are times that a single shoulder shrug could be an indicator that they are contradicting what they're saying. It has its merit when it's a change in baseline, and you maybe haven't seen that before. It would be something to key on. But the other day I saw a fellow, when I saw the single shoulder shrug for the first time, I said, ooh, what's going on here? But then I saw it again, and I saw it again, and I saw it again. Given in the context of the conversation, I pretty much concluded that this is part of his baseline. It's not a hot spot. It can be a hot spot, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a hot spot.
And I want to talk about this a little bit. I know you hate it, and I don't want to embarrass you, but I know you were identified as one of these these truth wizards that were able to do this without much training. Let's say that's like 5% or less of the people. So for the rest of us, how can we get this skill?
I think it's a composite skill set. There are several elements to it. As we've said, becoming an active listener and an active observer is a good start. Looking for changes in baseline. This is conditioning your behavior as an interviewer. You can do that. On the other hand, learning to read faces, to recognize and identify micros, is a very, very learnable skill. If you get access to that type training, and Ekman offers it online, that you can buy online access to one of his training programs. So I've been doing this with him for, 9 years? Inevitably, Ekman will say 1 hour. I like to have a little more time. But I would say in the course of 2 hours, the vast majority of people who take some training in reading faces, the vast majority improve, and most significantly. It's like learning to ride a bicycle also. And once you get it, you'll start seeing it more and more. And I think that in some ways, being tuned in and seeing a micro actually take place in real time is even better in some ways than the artificial training tool that Dr. Ekman came up with. But as a training tool, it is very effective. There have been many applications to this, whether it's professions or at home, family relationships. It's tremendous stuff.
Now, Paul, I think a lot of our listeners are going to be very interested in just exploring this area because of the applications within social engineering and security. But my question to you is, as a longtime observer of human nature and human behavior, how consistent do you find these tells? Because we will rely on this sort of training and nonverbals to make decisions about people or to make decisions about the situation. Have you found it to be fairly consistent? Because people, depending on the individual, are not always as consistent.
An interesting term, you use the word tell, and of course I think of that, the poker context. One of the things I thought was really setting micros apart from other types of nonverbal is that the tell is voluntary most of the time. You can fake the tell, which is what happened in James Bond in Casino Royale.
Right.
You can fake the body language, or you can actually use body language effectively by catching yourself or pointing the way you want to point, whether it's in a very gentle manner or in an aggressive manner. So the thing about the micros is that they're involuntary. Of course, if I see micros, I'm really watching them, but the consistency that I would suggest is the approach toward the interview. That's where you want to keep your consistency. If there's one thing you want to strive to keep consistent, it's your objectivity. You mentioned that earlier, and that is a critical learning skill for an interviewer. If you start getting subjective during the interview, you're going to risk going off on a tangent.
So really, it's not the consistency of the person being interviewed, but it's your consistency as an observer and as an interview that's really critical in this.
I think there is that, because if all of a sudden I see that someone is being inconsistent, that's probably a hot spot of some sort. On the other hand, if you're saying, in general, I see this or I see that, and then I come across something different, maybe you're suggesting that that is a cultural inconsistency that could also be a kind of hot spot.
It's just that I think sort of a well-rounded skill set is important in terms of being able to read people or make decisions about people. And so I was just curious, based on your great body of experience in this area, how consistent you found people to be in terms of leakage and being able to make decisions about whether or not they're being deceptive. And it sounds to me like as long as you're able to maintain your objectivity, you have found these skills to be fairly consistent and predictive of people's decisions and behaviors.
In general, most people are not good liars. In what context would we be lying about something? So I see a difference, for example, in interviewing witnesses or victims with a suspect who may be a recidivist, and they've been around the horn. This is not their first rodeo. They are a lot more comfortable in this scenario where they know they're probably going to have to fabricate or lie, in this case, the police. In general, I think people don't plan their interview. In fact, when we were getting ready for this podcast, I said, okay, should I structure out what I want to do? And I said, no, I think we just go for free flow here, because we're just having a good conversation, good discussion amongst us, but I didn't want it to be too structured. On the other hand, I like to plan the interview, but if I need to adapt, I want to have the flexibility that I'm not rigid in my approach, because I have to be responsive in the interview, especially if there's an element of trying to develop rapport. Even if it's in an adversarial situation, you can still try and develop some rapport, which is generally going to help the interview go along.
But how do you plan that out, Paul, when you're talking about unknowns? Let's say you did decide you were going to plan out this podcast. You don't know Jordan, you don't know Michelle, so how can you plan out what questions may be asked?
Well, of course, it's sort of like getting ready for a trial. The attorneys always tell you, we have to anticipate the cross-examination. So you be anticipating what you think you might be asked. Just like the other fundamental rule for the attorneys generally says, you never ask the question if you don't know the answer. You might be surprised. Even in a spontaneous interview, there's going to be a purpose to the questioning. That will be, in itself, be the framework that you would have. In the military, we talked about immediate action drills. So this is the comparison that I have. All of a sudden, you're thrust into a spontaneous interview situation, whether, you're the TSA guy at the airport, or you're trying to be social engineer your way past a receptionist or a checkpoint. All of a sudden, when something happens, at least initially, also, if there are others involved, we want to have a standard plan of action that initially, this is going to be the immediate response. If I see somebody and we're going to have a spontaneous interview, in the back of my head I'm saying, okay, have I seen something that makes me suspicious here or concerned? Why are we doing this, and what's the goal going to be of this encounter? Having some basic parameters as sort of your standby plan would be a good thing.
We kind of teach something like that in our classes, to plan out your engagements, and that's a question we always get asked. Well, how can you plan it out when there's so many unknown variables? Then your answer is similar. How would I want this to go?
The sports psychologists say this with the athletes. The night before the game, you play the game the way you want it to come out. You have one plan that would be the perfect solution. So you can go into it with you're trying to achieve your goal. That's probably the fundamental rule. How you go about that, and what are some of the options? What techniques can you use? What if it's this? What if it's that? What if it's something else? What if they're antagonistic? What if they're skeptical? What if they're sympathetic? Then you've got those contingency plans ready to pick from your kit bag whichever route you want to go.
Are there certain sets of nonverbal behavior that could indicate someone may be a threat, right? So I'm thinking about all of our industries here. So what Michelle and I do for a living, we teach people sometimes security awareness procedures. And it's nice to say, hey, this set of nonverbal says someone's a threat. But also in Jordan's line of work, he's teaching people to go out and interact with others. And maybe there's a set of nonverbals that can say, hey, this guy's not the safest. Yeah, he's a threat. You might want to back off. Is there a set of nonverbals that people can look for that says you want to back away?
Well, let's look at micros again for an example, and then we can talk about macros in the same vein. Of the 7 emotions that Ekman's identified, happy, sad, fear, surprise, anger, disgust, contempt, the ones that could potentially cause harm to us or in a confrontation is if we start seeing anger, disgust, or contempt. If someone's afraid, if someone's happy, if someone's surprised, if someone's sad, what's the consequence to me of this, okay? But if I start seeing anger or contempt, usually directed externally towards somebody, whereas even disgust could be internally, the early signs of confrontation are something I'm always looking for. If you see someone tighten up, or if you see them clench their fists when they're talking, they hold their breath a bit, you can start to pick up that maybe things are escalating here it could break bad here. So I want to keep my guard up. So in terms of personal safety, that's one of the things in a law enforcement type interview that I'm watching for. And I hope there's somebody there with me as well that's also watching for it.
That's the question that we get asked sometimes, and it's also a topic that I think would be interesting.
In terms of body language, if I see somebody close up in their body language to me or push back, even in a seated situation, they're pushing back, creating more distance in our body space, what's that telling me? Should that be a clue to me that what did I say, what did I do, where are we going with this, what's happening here? And same with voices in their speech pattern. If we see a change in their speech and the rate of their speech, or the volume or the pitch, all of a sudden, these are all changes in baseline. They all could constitute hotspots. Right there, we've talked about verbal, nonverbal, facial, all kinds of things can be going on that we've got to be aware as listeners and observers.
Reverse this now. Have you ever been able to use your nonverbals to get out of a sticky situation? Maybe you're in a situation that feels a little threatening, so you've used some purposeful nonverbal behavior that changed that situation.
One of the great skill sets on nonverbal, like on body language, as I mentioned earlier, it's one thing to be able to read body language in other people. The other thing is you can use body language to your own advantage, to soften up a little bit, to try and diffuse what might be coming a little tense, pointing earlier. So I always try, and at least initially when I point to somebody, I use my whole hand, and I have the palm of my hand up, and I point that way with my whole hand to somebody, instead of just using my index finger coming down real hard. I think in body language, a voice, you can soften, catch yourself, your voice is rising, things are getting a little edgy. Try and back off a little bit. And I think you can do it effectively sometimes with your body language.
So it's just a matter of kind of lowering your threat posture, making yourself appear more humble, and using those open ventral displays.
That's an excellent point. And, again, we get into whether it's the alpha role or whatever, and sometimes you just back down a little bit and to diffuse a situation. You're not necessarily relinquishing or conceding anything to somebody, but you are trying to get in control of the situation.
Because in our class, we also teach something we call ego suspension. For our industry, especially, it's an important topic because, a lot of times really smart people want everyone to know how smart they really are. So it's hard to suspend your ego when you're dealing with others, especially if someone says something that is wrong or, that may be a little off. So we tell people, if you could suspend your ego, come in more humble, not just verbally, but also non-verbally, then it makes people less aggressive towards you.
That's a very good tactic, and I think that you could almost play it back. If somebody says something that is not correct, first of all, that doesn't mean somebody's lying, right? They just made a misstatement. It depends on the consequence at the time. If something could have an immediate consequence of that misstatement, then you have to correct it. But if it isn't, then you just let it go. And then on the other hand, maybe when we're offline and one-on-one, I could say to somebody, hey, Bill, just to clarify something, I believe if you look at this, you'll find that this is the case and not that. Now you're really scoring points because they realize you could have called them out on it and you didn't, and then you're coming across as trying to help them. So it becomes a win-win for you instead of it becoming a lose-lose for them. But fundamentally, I believe a colleague of yours, Chris, is it Robin?
Robin Dreek. Yep.
Something about It's Not About Me or
Yeah,
something?
that book's all about building rapport.
And in your book, when you were talking about rapport building, I specifically remember reading about the suspension of ego. So it's a good technique.
It works amazingly well.
I think generalistically, one of the ones I talk about is there used to be a TV detective show, I'm dating myself now, but with Peter Falk as the star, and it was called Columbo. Columbo is my model interviewer, okay, because he's very seldom intimidating. He always comes across self-deprecating and, gee, forgive me, I know this is probably a stupid question. And that disarms the other side. And they start to think that this guy's some sort of a buffoon, and it becomes a win-win for Columbo.
That's the thing that always got me upset with the show Lie to Me. Season 2 and 3, the main character became very arrogant and aggressive, and that seems counterproductive to interviewing, and especially interviewing while using nonverbals.
Dr. Ekman was the scientific technical advisor to the show, Lie to Me. And of course, the whole show is based on the life and work of Dr. Paul Ekman. Even the character Tim Roth played, his name was Cal Lightman. Cal Lightman, Paul Ekman. The Lightman Group, the Ekman Group. Even carrying on further, one of Roth's colleagues was a psychologist, Dr. What was her role name? Gillian Foster. I happen to think that correlates very strongly to Dr. Maureen O'Sullivan. And then the natural that was played on the show is supposed to represent the wizards. I think at times even Ekman knew that being an advisor doesn't mean they have to take his advice.
Right.
And if I were to look at it, I think the show deteriorated because it had less emphasis on science and psychology, which was one of the big draws to the first season, and it became more Hollywood and the subplots. I really think on the show itself, you mentioned the character trait is too many times, from my point of view, I thought that Cal Lightman, Tim Roth's role, he was too spontaneous, he was not objective, he shot from the hip, and he was obnoxious and arrogant sometimes. And these are not the traits, in my mind, of a good interviewer. You know, evidently that's what the producer thought, and that's what Tim Roth thought. I don't know. I wasn't there.
Michelle and I can both say this after spending some time with Dr. Ekman and myself working with him over the last couple of years. That definitely does not fit him. The arrogant, aggressive side. So if that character was based on him, it was very loose.
As I understand it from talking with Dr. Ekman, you know, he had quite a few conditions on letting them run the show based on his life, and that is they wouldn't use his name, and he didn't want it to be specifically relevant to his own life experience. And maybe they went out of their way to create a role behavior that was not only inconsistent with, but contradictory to Paul Ekman's own personality. Because, again, I think Columbo more than I think Tim Roth in terms of that role.
Did you always know that you had this ability to kind of read people's nonverbals, or was it just identified after you met Ekman and started working with him?
Oh, no. Even, I'll never forget when Dr. O'Sullivan told me, we've researched, you've done all of this, and now we've determined that you're a wizard, and how does that make you feel? What's new? I mean, well, I said, if anything, it reminds me that I can be wrong at least 20% of the time, which is not the tack that some of the other wizards took. Most of the wizards that I've met are very low-key about this. I don't like to play it up at all. I sometimes think that they're making too much of it. But when it gets back to it, I think that I'm not so sure if it's natural or innate. Ekman had some words about that. But I think it's also built on your whole life experience. I used to joke, and I remember the first time O'Sullivan asked me about this, I said, hey, what do you want? I'm an Irish Catholic from Boston who joined the Marine Corps. To me, right and wrong, black and white is pretty clear cut. And the consequences were pretty clear cut. And they chuckled over that. I think most of the wizards are very low-key about it. And if you're smart, it'd be foolish to let it get to your head. Although there's a couple out there that are very proud of this, and they make this a claim to fame or their profession or whatever. I just think it's all part of dealing with people. On the other hand, going back, I can still remember there was one case I was working with another agent, and I think as I look over, we had talked about different types of criminals, but in this case it was a forger. Secret Service criminal jurisdiction was dealing primarily with theft and forgery of checks or counterfeiting of U.S. currency, and then we got into credit card fraud, and then we got into electronic fraud. I interviewed this suspect who was a suspect at the time. I walked out of there with my interview saying, I'm pretty damn sure this guy did it. Also because there was some forensic indicators in terms of handwriting exemplars. When I asked him, for example, I said, so you're telling me I won't find your fingerprints on that check? And there was this big long pause. Why would there be a pause? Either you know your fingerprints could be on that check or not. That was a good example right there. So then he said, well, you might, because maybe I handled them in the mailroom or something. And I said, well, when they're in the mailroom, they're in an envelope, aren't they? So I walked out of there figuring, this guy probably did it. I go into my other agent, buddy of mine, go in and see if you can get this guy to roll. And he sits down and he's talking with him for about 30 minutes, and he comes out and he says, I don't think he did it. You're kidding me. And the guy was very convincing. I think there could have been a number of factors. Age, this is a much younger agent. Maybe they thought they could roll this guy over a little bit, deceive him or whatever. And so I just said, you go back in there, you ask him, if we send this out for the handwriting, it's going to come back, he did it. If we send it back for fingerprints, it's going to come back, he did it. And ask him what he thinks about that. Then the guy rolled. Even then, I felt like I could be a pretty good judge of whether someone was telling the truth or not. Later on, when I learned about micros and other aspects that I could consciously, know what I was seeing, then I think that took my interviewing skills to the next level. But I think that's true for anybody. If they go out and learn nonverbal, whether it's body language or micros, it's going to take their skill set to the next level. And that's what we strive for, which is why I can't understand why people wouldn't want to do it.
I hear you. Paul, usually when we have guests on, we ask them a couple questions as we wrap it up. I know people can find out a little more about you on the paulekman.com site under the About the Paul Ekman Group. There's some information on you there. But we have a lot of avid readers that listen to the podcast. So is there any books that you would recommend on the topics that we've talked about today that you think kind of just hit the nail on the head and should be required reading for someone interested in this?
I could start off by mentioning your book, Chris, but people would probably think that was a leading question.
Well, thank you, but I promote that enough myself.
Ekman's basic works, Emotions Revealed, Telling Lies, both by Paul Ekman. One of his best books that I enjoyed reading, especially if you're a parent or a teacher, is Why Kids Lie. That's an excellent book. The book that he wrote, collaborated with the Dalai Lama on emotional awareness, is an excellent book. He wrote the foreword to your book, and Unmasking the Social Engineer. In that context, I think one of the strengths of your book is like Ekman's book, Emotions Revealed and Telling Lies. It deals with science, but in layman's approach. Even in Ekman being a psychologist, he very seldom goes into the scientific psychojargon. A lot of it is just good reading that people can get. I really liked Blink by Malcolm Gladwell.
That's a great book.
In fact, there's a chapter in there on Paul Ekman. There's also a chapter in there on the fellow who was my company commander when I was a second lieutenant. At the time, Captain Paul K. Van Riper, later retired as a lieutenant general in the United States Marine Corps. But he's in that book. Daniel Goleman's book on emotional intelligence is excellent. These are just some of the ones that come to mind right off the top of my head.
I do agree with what you were saying. I think before I even met Dr. Ekman, one of the things that attracted me to his books was that I was reading super intelligent material that was not making me feel dumb. I enjoyed that, This has been excellent, Paul. Really, really good. Me personally, I learned new things as always when I talk to you. So I can't thank you enough for spending some time with us today on the podcast.
It's important that if we're in the business of being interviewers, but on a much more common denominator, this is interpersonal communications, whether it's verbal or nonverbal. And we all want to be better at that. So if you can strive to become a better listener and a better observer, and if you can learn facial microexpressions, like as I said, it's a readily learnable skill. And you can get the online access through Ekman's website. It's there. You can build on all of this stuff. And in conclusion, what I'd say is I always think of Sherlock Holmes, and one of the favorite quotes of Sherlock Holmes is, I have trained myself to notice what I see. That's a great summary of what we're trying to do here in becoming better at what we do.
One last question, Paul, and I know everyone in the audience is thinking this. Are you a poker player?
I've played a little bit of poker. A lot of it I don't understand. I don't understand the science, the math, the probability, the odds of poker. It's very important to remember that just because somebody is good at detecting deception doesn't mean somebody is good at conducting deception. So I might be able to read somebody at the table, but I am entirely too emotional as a player. I'm probably a very easy read. But again, I remember that the tells, I think if I were a poker player, I would try and build things into my baseline, quote unquote, which would be an artificial baseline, that would confuse them for somehow. And I notice now a lot of them are wearing these big wide-brimmed hats and fedoras and sunglasses to try and cover up as much as they can. In a word, no, I would not want to go in and play even blackjack at the casino.
Wise words. Thank you.
The only other one, Chris, I believe it's attributed to Mark Twain, and he said, always tell the truth. That way, you don't have to remember what you said. Now, there is so much to that, because if somebody is going to have to fabricate a story, then they have to remember their story. Normally, the story or the cover is very shallow, and it becomes very vulnerable to in-depth questioning. It might get you by the first, it's not going to stand up.
How true that is. Great advice. Can't thank you enough. Thank you so much.
Okay, nice meeting you and talking with you, Michelle and Jordan.
Thank you. Nice meeting you as well. Thank you for your time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, another awesome podcast. I really enjoyed working with that guy. At one point during the book writing, we were out in Chicago together. We did a joint speech for SC Congress. And I had a chance one evening just to sit with him for a few hours and hear some of his stories from his old government days, his world travels, his Olympic work. And he's got some amazing stories of using nonverbals and reading nonverbals and just interviewing, and really interesting guy. A lot going on, a lot we can learn from. So I was really happy to finally get him on the show after working with him for the last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And an excellent human being.
Even more so. Just one of these genuinely nice guys. Next month, if everything works out, we're going to have Dr. Ekman on the podcast. So,
oh, wow.
Super excited about that. He'll be our second return guest. Robin Dreek's the only guest we've had on more than once, but Dr. Ekman was on a couple years ago, but now after writing the book, he's got some brand new research we're going to talk about. In the meantime, you can follow us on Twitter. Our account is Human Hacker, or the corporate Twitter is SOC Engineer Inc. You got both of our websites, social-engineer.org and social-engineer.com. If you're an IRC user, you have irc.freenode.net, channel social-engineer. Heck, send a carrier pigeon somewhere in the U.S. and we'll find it. But until next month, we'll see you.
Goodbye.
Adios.
I'm gone cold. My heart is gone. I'm gone cold. The path gives way to a cold winter field. The ground below, hard as steel. Beyond the hill, a distant song, but that hill keeps going on and on. My heart is gone. I'm gone cold. My heart is gone. Swan boats and daisy chains. Can't seem to recall any given name. I see the footprints, how they come, how they go. Was that only a moment, or many years ago? My heart is gone.